So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, good afternoon to all of you here in the room, and hello to those who are watching us through the webcast. And let me wish you a warm welcome to this side event on the margins of the 10th Review Conference of the NPT, titled Taking Forward Nuclear Risk Reduction. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Felix Baumann, and I'm the permanent representative of Switzerland to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and I have the pleasure to serve as the moderator for this event. We will start with a couple of opening remarks, and I have the pleasure to welcome here today with us, first of all, UNIDIR Director Robin Geis, as well as my dear colleague from Geneva, permanent representative of the Netherlands to the CD, Ambassador Robert Jan Gabrielse. Robin, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Felix. Excellencies, honored delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to the first in a series of side events that UNIDIR is organizing with our partners at the 10th NPT Review Conference. Just to do a bit of a promo tour here, on Wednesday, UNIDIR, together with the EU, will host a side event on narratives around the Middle East, WMD-free zone. And on Friday, together with a cross-regional group of states, we will dive into gender mainstreaming in the NPT. And of course, we would be delighted to welcome you to those events as well. Today's topic of nuclear risk reduction is a core element of the NPT review process. And indeed, as you know already, the preamble of the NPT highlights the need to make every effort to avert the danger of nuclear war. And risk reduction measures such as de-alerting and de-targeting have been a significant component of the review processes for many cycles, but the topic has gained in prominence in the last couple of years. It has been highlighted by the Secretary General Antonio Guterres in his agenda for disarmament, and has been the subject of NPT working papers from such diverse groups as the P5 and the Stockholm Initiative. And it's easy to understand why. Competition between the nuclear weapon states is at levels not seen since the end of the Cold War, and military conflicts are being fought under the nuclear shadow. Of course, nuclear risk reduction is not a substitute for nuclear disarmament, but at the present juncture, it is safe to say that it is more urgent than ever before. At UNIDIR, we're working to better understand the nature of today's nuclear risks and develop technically and politically feasible measures to mitigate such risks. Recognizing the significance of the risk reduction concept, we have established a dedicated project focused on nuclear risk reduction within our WMD program. This project has created the framework for analyzing nuclear risk reduction and suggested ways to close pathways to nuclear weapons use. UNIDIR's Nuclear Risk Reduction Policy Briefing Series has investigated specific geographic and technical areas of risk reduction. And our latest series of reports is a collaboration between the Risk Reduction Workstream and other UNIDIR programs, which looks at the risks coming from the intersection of nuclear and other domains. We have, in this context, published a report on the cyber-nuclear nexus, and we're currently studying how outer space security impacts nuclear risks. All our publications are open access and freely available online on our website, and we do hope they help both decision makers and scholars to dive deeper into the challenges and explore possible options for risk reduction. The 10th NPT Review Conference is proving a busy 4 weeks, of course. And within this period, it's unlikely states will be able to unravel and tackle all nuclear risks. But perhaps the review conference could set in motion steps towards more systematic and sustainable nuclear risk reduction measures. From our side at UNIDIR, we're pursuing an innovative research program in this area, and we have plans for further work in the future, including, for example, research into the implications for nuclear risk reduction posed by the increased divergence in security and threat perceptions among the nuclear weapon states. If if you're interested in engaging or even partnering with UNIDIR on these topics, please reach out to Andre and the team. Now, it's a busy 4 weeks, as I said, and I don't want to take any more time from the stellar lineup of speakers that we have for this afternoon. So I'll conclude by expressing my gratitude to our partners who made this event possible: the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and BASIC. Thanks so very much for your support. And of course, warm thanks are due to our team at UNIDIR and Andre, who spent a lot of time in putting this event together. Thanks very much. I look forward to hopefully productive and certainly exciting discussions. And back to you, Felix.
Thank you so much, Robin. And let me indeed join you in thanking your team for all its efforts in bringing together such a distinct panel of experts today. And of course, for all the substantive work and research done in the past that helped us a great way to frame the topic of nuclear risk reduction as we are now today. Now, as I said before, let me turn to permanent representative of the Netherlands to the CD, Ambassador Robert Jan Gabrielse. Robert, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Felix. And I must say it's an honor that the Netherlands to co-host this side event on nuclear risk reduction with such good partners which are represented here along in this panel. Given the current geopolitical environment in which the 10th NPT Review Conference takes place, the issue of nuclear risk reduction is both timely and urgent. The growing interest in this subject, both in the NPT community as well as amongst academia in recent months, illustrates an urgency of nuclear risk reduction. Reducing the risks of nuclear weapons use can contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security and increase mutual trust and confidence. Given the low level of trust currently in the international community, rebuilding trust and confidence is much needed. In this way, nuclear risk reduction can play an important role in facilitating progress on nuclear disarmament. Nuclear risk reduction must be seen as conducive to nuclear disarmament and not as a substitute. Throughout the review cycle, the Netherlands has actively supported research on this topic, including by BASIC and the Klingendahl Institute in the Netherlands. Also within the Stockholm Initiative and NPDI, the subject of nuclear risk reduction has been actively debated and led to concrete deliverables for the RevCon. Moreover, the engagement by the nuclear weapon states, including through their joint working paper, is a welcome development. And I guess we will hear more about this later. The Netherlands hopes that the review conference can agree upon concrete nuclear risk reduction measures. Priority topics for the Netherlands are: first, increasing transparency of the nuclear weapon states, including through a debate of nuclear doctrines. In our view, there must be scope for further steps on this. For instance, a baseline on nuclear holdings is lacking, and a dialogue between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states on doctrines is yet to take place. Second, improving communication channels will contribute to the crisis management toolbox. Third, measures to increase the decision-making time in crisis situations are an important contribution towards nuclear risk reduction. And fourth and final, steps aimed at increasing strategic stability should be considered. These measures are interlinked and can strengthen each other. Moreover, any other measure that contributes further to nuclear risk reduction must be positively considered. In closing, there are many good ideas on the table, and I'm certain that the excellent experts on our panel will have further thought-provoking proposals on how to put the ideas into concrete measures to be agreed at this Review Conference. And I'm looking forward to the interaction with all of you. So with this, thank you, Felix.
Thank you also to you, Robert, and let me highlight the active role that the Netherlands is playing, as you said, on the topic of nuclear risk reduction, both within the Stockholm Initiative and NPDI. So thank you so much. So today's side event is meant to contribute to an informed discussion on the topic of nuclear risk reduction. And so our speakers will consider the evolution of the nuclear risk reduction agenda, but also identify practical measures that can be implemented in the short term, including in the area of crisis prevention and crisis management. And then, in a second step, explore priorities for the international community in advancing a multilateral agenda on risk reduction. So, once again, we are very pleased to have four very distinct expert speakers, all of whom have looked at issues of nuclear risk and strategic stability from different angles and different perspectives. So the format of today's discussion will be actually a moderated conversation followed by questions and answers from the audience. So there will first be 2 rounds of questions to each panelist, and then following this I'll open the floor to the audience. And after the discussion, I'm pleased to say that Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Alexandra Bell will provide some additional remarks from a P5 perspective. So let's go to the panel. I should note, first of all, so that all panelists are speaking in their own personal capacity. Before we start, let me just very briefly introduce them. So first of all, on the far left of the panel, on your far left, Marion Messmer is the co-director of BASIC. She leads BASIC's risk reduction program, Stepping Stones to Disarmament, and the Gender and Nuclear Weapons program. Then we have also on the left side of the panel, Tong Shao, who is a senior fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a visiting research scholar at Princeton University's Science and Global Security Program. And then on the on your right side, we have Andrei Baklitsky. He's a senior researcher in the WMD program at UNIDIR. And finally, on the at the other end of the table, Leah Walker, who is Defense Technology Associate at the Institute for Security and Technology. So let me already at this stage thank you all for joining us. And I'm now going to start with the first round of questions on the current landscape of nuclear risk, and I will start maybe with Marion. Marion, in your view, are the nuclear risks actually changing in Europe, or are we seeing pretty much the same picture, just with more intensity?
Thank you for that really interesting and difficult to answer question. I think, as ever in our policy area, the answer isn't so clear cut. So I think we see both an intensification of existing risks as well as some new risks emerging. In terms of the intensity changing, the war in Ukraine means that we're now assessing any risks through a lens of ongoing conflict in Europe, which means that the background tensions are even higher than they already were, which means that everyone is going to be very alert and vigilant. That means that actions are going to be evaluated through a lens of suspicion, which might mean that the actions are essentially seen as more threatening than they are perhaps intended. So in other words, the conflict makes it more likely that actors misperceive each other's actions. On the other hand, it also means that actors are very aware of the consequences of further escalation, and hopefully we might also see that therefore there might be a bit more reticence, but essentially the risk and the impact of possible misperception is even higher now than it might have been last year or throughout previous years of this review cycle, where we all had been very concerned about increasing tensions. We also have a new risk, which I'm sure is also on everyone's minds, which is through the potential use of nuclear power plants during the conflict. I'm sure you all have seen the really worrying developments in the last few days. This is something that has been brought about directly by the conflict, and that we wouldn't have seen in a peace situation. So I think in that sense, that's a new risk that we previously didn't have. I also think the rhetoric escalation is an increase. It's perhaps not quite a new risk, but it's certainly an intensified risk. And I think, this is also something that in a conflict situation is very different to a peacetime situation. We're all used to various levels of rhetoric signaling. It's part of the nuclear game in a way, whether we like it or not. But in a conflict situation, it's potentially much more impactful and much more dangerous than it would be at times of peace. So, in short, we need to remember that risks are the multiplication of the likelihood of an event happening and the impact of an event happening. And what we have seen in the last few months is that the likelihood of something going wrong has increased dramatically, whereas the impact has always been very high. So in that sense, I think risks have both intensified as well as new risks have come on the table. So, that's all very concerning, and I'm looking forward to hearing what other colleagues also think we can do about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion, for highlighting the worrying new risks beside the increase of existing risks. And now let me turn from Europe to Asia. And basically, Tong, the same question for you. What, in your opinion, is the driver of nuclear risks in this part of the world?
Well, thank you so much. I think Asia is a region that we really need to worry about in terms of risks. Almost all the nuclear-armed states in Asia are building up. I think this is the perhaps only place in the world where nuclear weapon states are actively building up their nuclear forces. The nationalism, domestic nationalism, is very high in many of these countries. And many major countries in the region are turning inward looking. The free flow of information between them and the outside world is becoming more difficult. And as a result, many countries become more determined to achieve their national security goals, even that means to use force. So that makes many of the military flashpoints in this region particularly dangerous, including Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, and Southern Asia between India and Pakistan, among other places. With many countries become more self-righteous and enhance their power-centric thinking, they become less interested in using soft measures, arms control, confidence-building measures, to resolve international disputes. Instead, they increasingly rely more on one's own material power, including military power, to achieve national security goals. And as a result, I think in Asia we have already a very serious risk of arms race, including at the conventional military level, the nuclear level, and also with greater entanglement between nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. And we see many countries in this region becoming more interested in leveraging military risks to achieve their security goals. The belief is that an effective deterrence requires risk-taking. Right? If you can appear to be more risk acceptant, then you will obtain advantage in an international dispute. And the Ukraine war, unfortunately, in Europe, I think helped strengthen some of these thinkings in Asia, because what the Russian neighbor nuclear saber rattling demonstrates in a war is that a nuclear-armed country does not have to explicitly use or threaten to use nuclear weapons. It can simply send implicit and ambiguous nuclear signals in order to achieve coercive impact. I think that would encourage similar thinking and even practice in this part of the world, in Asia. A major problem is many countries disagree about the sources of nuclear risks. In the case of US and China, US likes to complain about China's nuclear conventional deal-capable ballistic missile systems. The argument is if China starts to mobilize those missile systems or even starts to launch those missiles, how can the United States know whether those missiles are armed with nuclear or conventional warheads? So that could lead to American misunderstanding or even overreaction. Well, the Chinese argument is, okay, the risk would not be there if the United States does not have a launch on warning posture, right? If the US simply have the patience to wait and find out. So with the disagreement on who is ultimately responsible for causing risks, I think that prevents them to starting to cooperate. My last very brief comment is, in many countries in this region, I'm afraid, including in the expert community, in the general public, people don't really appreciate the cost of war, including the risk of nuclear war. The humanitarian consequences movement doesn't really have impact and influence in this region. So that makes it hard for the public to effectively have a say and have a voice on policy making. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tong, for this exhaustive expose of the risks in Asia. And let us leave briefly Earth and go up to the cyberspace and outer space. And maybe Andrei, for you, what kind of risks do we have there?
Thank you for the question. When we talk about risks in cyberspace and outer space, of course, we face the same factors as my colleagues has been mentioning before: great power competition, diverging risk perceptions, but there also are specific challenges as well. First of all, we have both qualitative and quantitative increase of use of those two domains. Every day we witness more things connected to digital networks, and we have more objects in space. And we also increasingly depend on those two domains for both everyday lives and national security. And we also have new things. We have, for example, new Inspectra satellites in orbit. We have new offensive software, which also has new capabilities. So that's one factor. And the second factor is that red lines in space and cyber are less clear than they might be on Earth. Some of it is intentional to deter the opponents, to leave them guessing, but some stems from the fact that we actually never really had nuclear-related crisis in space or in cyberspace. It is safe to say that attack against nuclear command and control, be it in outer space, in cyberspace, would be crossing the red line. But it leaves us with a lot of gray area beneath that, and that gray area gives, possibilities for misperception, miscalculation, or misunderstanding, which can lead to nuclear escalation. For example, what about meddling with communication and reconnaissance systems? Would that be below the red line? Or consider spying. Would hacking into your opponent's nuclear systems to collect information constitute an attack against nuclear command and control? Would proximity maneuvers around an early warning or communication satellite be seen as an imminent threat? International regulation is in short supply in those domains, and in the time of direct conflict, which unfortunately is getting more and more possible, nuclear weapon states just simply might decide that they're not willing to take any chances. And if something is going on, then maybe you need a strong response to that. And this, again, could be leading to escalation. So just wrapping things up, space, outer space and cyberspace are two additional domains which we should be following really closely. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei, and for highlighting the gray areas in terms of red lines that might lead to further misperceptions. And now maybe with Leah, a bit another angle, another topic in the nuclear risk discussions that we had so far. We often speak of the need for robust communication systems, and you have actually, Leah, spoken, researched, and written extensively on the fact that the nuclear armed states lack necessary communication channels. So what do you think, what are the biggest challenges or the biggest problems that we face in this sphere?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to UNIDIR and BASIC and to the government of the Netherlands and Switzerland for having me in this panel today. I think that the past 2 coming on 3 years have really shown the importance of communication between all states, but particularly states with nuclear weapons. COVID-19 has led to an era where we've seen a significant reduction in in-person interactions between leadership of different countries. As such, you need to rely on different pathways of communication. And I think there's several concerns with the current communication ecosystem when it comes to national dialogue and the actual systems used for that dialogue. The first is that those communication systems are not necessarily secure or reliable. There has been significant advances in offensive cyber capabilities, which means that we can sort of assume that lots of communication systems have been breached. Likewise, there are kinetic threats to existing communication systems, whether that's environmental degradation due to climate change, environmental degradation due to conflict, or simply targeting during conflict. One of the sort of difficulties with communications is that as critical as they are to negotiations and to ending conflict, they are also the first thing to be targeted in a conflict. The first thing a country will do at the onset of kinetic hostilities is go after its adversaries' communication systems. And if there are not separate avenues through which to negotiate, you can find yourself without your phone call out, shall we say. Additionally, existing communication ties when it comes to hotlines and other crisis communications to avert nuclear misconception or nuclear war, they tend to be bilateral. There, at the moment, is no multilateral hotline, and there are still countries with nuclear weapons that do not have a hotline connection to other countries with nuclear weapons. As the world becomes more involved with each other's affairs, there is no longer areas. For example, for a long time, there was less of a perceived need for the European countries to have hotlines to countries in South Asia, for example. But as risks are increasingly globalized, there is that need for multilateral communication from all of the different countries with nuclear weapons. And then additionally, I think very pertinent to this review conference as we talk about risk reduction and the need for additional communication, too often these sorts of communication systems like hotlines are put in place retroactively after a crisis, be it the MoLink or the direct communication line, or as we know it as the red telephone between the US and Russia, put in place after the Cuban Missile Crisis, or a series of quite useful deconfliction lines that we've seen put in place after conflict. There is a lot of advantage to setting up the infrastructure for these sorts of communication lines before things go poorly rather than after.
Thank you so much, Leah. And actually, let me thank all the four panelists for your thorough assessment of the current risk situation from four different perspectives. And so let's now maybe move to the second set of questions, and let us a bit project ourselves into the future and what should be the priorities for the international community in moving forward. And so let me start maybe in the same order again, first with Marion, and come back to Europe. And what do you think, Marion, what could be realistically done with regard to reducing nuclear risks in Europe in the immediate future, but also in the longer term?
Thanks for that question. I think what we can do now and what we can do in the future are two quite different things, in part again because of the ongoing conflict. So the risks that we can focus on now in terms of reducing them are any risks to further escalation, and especially to escalation to the nuclear level. So I think nuclear escalation ought to be taken off the table as an option, and that could be done by outlining or discussing exactly under what circumstances actors currently worry such an escalation might happen, and then ensuring that we take the necessary steps to distancing ourselves from those situations. I think that's really difficult given the current environment, given the extremely high levels of distrust, because the more tense the environment is, the less likely states are able to actually constructively engage with one another and talk to one another. However, I also think that this is just crucially important, so it ought to be tried. At the same time, I mentioned the rhetoric escalation earlier. A big concern with rhetoric escalation is also that it might lead to burning bridges for future conversations. So I think, not only does it have a direct impact in terms of reducing the possibility of nuclear escalation, but it also builds a foundation for future dialogue. Leah just mentioned the importance of crisis communication. I think this is something that is crucially important during a crisis. So ensuring that all crisis communication lines are open and used is something really basic that we can do, that makes sure that if there is such a risk of misperception or misunderstanding, we actually talk to one another before acting. And I think everyone needs to remember the possible costs that we're talking about here, and therefore show restraint. And I think this is something that we unfortunately haven't consistently seen in this crisis, where there could be a lot of improvement. And then finally, something that is working really well at the moment and that I want to continue to see working is using existing arms control agreements to signal intent. So we have seen that, for example, under the New START treaty, notifications are happening really regularly and consistently. That's a really positive thing. It ought to be highlighted that that's a really positive thing. And that should also continue. Because this is how we see the utility of our existing arms control agreements, which can also hopefully pave the way for future arms control. And then in the future, I think the biggest thing, the biggest issue that we face post-conflict is that we need to address the underlying distrust, especially because that distrust has increased a lot during this crisis. Because otherwise, if we don't address this issue, we will remain stuck in this cycle of conflict, and the current high levels of mistrust are just not conducive to new arms control agreements or any other of the many issues that we need to tackle together. So. And then the other big thing that we can address once we have dealt with the mistrust issue, or at the same time as we're dealing with the mistrust issue, is just this very long list of different risk reduction options that we at BASIC and many of our other NGO colleagues at UNIDIR and in other places have spent the last few years compiling. There's so much that we can do. I'm not going to go into all of it right now, but a lot of it has to do with improving communications, improving our mutual understanding of each other's doctrines and postures, and then seeing where we overlap so that we can go forward on the pathway to reducing risks and hopefully creating more stability and also creating more opportunities for arms control and then disarmament. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion, for this very exhaustive list of measures, and especially your thinking on the need for creating a situation to lower mistrust, both in the short term, but especially, of course, as a longer-term measure. Now, let me turn to Tong with a very similar question. Now, of course, about Asia. What measures do you see there to reduce risk for risk reduction?
Well, thank you. I think it is a real problem that many Asian countries genuinely don't see a real risk of nuclear use. So I think the first mission is to build a shared understanding on nuclear risk. I think in the government apparatus, especially in sectors like the military, the defense industry, where they are usually insulated from international exchanges, it's usually the case that those sectors have even less appreciation of nuclear risk. And in fact, those actors have a lot of influence in national security policy making. So somehow we need to address that. One way to do that is to increase, this sounds like a cliche, but to increase international exchange and substantive discussion. Carnegie Endowment had a series of workshops with a think tank in China a few years ago on the impact of cyber technologies on nuclear command control system. And it is through this back and forth and substantive expert level exchange, it helped participants from both countries to develop deeper understandings about how things can go wrong. How they may not be aware of certain escalation pathways before, but it's through these exchanges they start, I think, developing that knowledge. Second point, which I think is to echo Macron's point on Marion's point on distrust. There's a lot of suspicion in China about the American proposal to do risk reduction. Right? The suspicion is the U.S. is using this as an excuse to slow down China's development of legitimate defense capabilities. Right? But I think one way to overcome that or to mitigate that is to help each other understanding their own national policy, including historical policy. Because if Chinese experts are aware that the United States had taken serious efforts to prevent commingling of nuclear and conventional capabilities by canceling the conventional Trident modification program, I think they would, become less suspicious about American intent. Third point, I think, in order for, because countries are so preoccupied with developing capabilities, naturally they are paying less attention to how those capabilities might introduce inadvertent risk of nuclear use. But in order to hold the government's decision-making accountable, to make sure their decisions would not introduce unnecessary risks, it requires robust domestic debate and policy scrutiny. In some countries, they are, starting to introduce long-term warning capabilities, putting more nuclear forces on higher alert during peacetime. I think those policies require more domestic discussion and debate. And last quick point is to raise public awareness. It should be allowed for the general public to discuss and debate these issues about the impact of nuclear war. It should be allowed that civil society actors can educate the public on the impact of nuclear war. it should be allowed that simulations about the consequences of nuclear war can be conducted and the results be revealed to the public. The surveys about public opinions on these issues should be allowed to be done and the results be reviewed. I think that's the necessary domestic policies required to seriously reducing nuclear risk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tong. And let me revert again to Andrei, and let's go back to cyberspace and outer space. And I mean, risk reduction in those contexts, what is your assessment? Is it similar as in other domains or different? And how can it be moved forward?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Well, a general approach to reducing nuclear risks is universal, and it applies to outer space and cyberspace as well. You want states to show restraint. You want more communication between parties. You want make sure you get the right information on right time. You want to decrease the role of nuclear weapons, and eventually you want to disarm to get to nuclear zero. But of course, there are specifics to cyberspace and outer space. For example, outer space and cyberspace systems can threaten the retaliatory capability of nuclear armed states in different ways. So examining exactly what are those ways provides insight into potential trigger events, and studying those is a prerequisite for effective risk reduction. It is also critical to consider states' doctrines, postures, and capabilities in cyber, outer space, and nuclear spheres to, again, help identify pathways to potential nuclear use, which stem from things happening in those areas. And it's very important for states to look into common understanding, as Tong was mentioning, of risks, threats, and vulnerabilities in outer space and cyberspace. And direct engagement on this topic between the states can, of course, minimize potential problems and mitigate the consequences if they take place. And we have a very detailed report in UNIDIR, as Robin mentioned, about cyber nuclear nexus, and we are working currently on a report about space nuclear nexus. The other thing which we have to have in mind is that, unlike, say, the conventional military forces, both outer space and cyberspace have a lot of different stakeholders, not only nation states. You have international organizations, you have industry, which is growing and which has huge impact on both of those spheres, and states need to engage with them as well if you want to talk about nuclear risk reduction in space, in cyberspace. You want to build on the current foundations, broader norms of behavior, which will also include those players. And last but not least, and I think this is really what differs space and cyberspace from a lot of other spheres, is that outer space and cyber infrastructure would benefit greatly from increased security of its components, and that could be a valuable risk reduction measure. So protecting the assets from attacks, hardening them, adding redundancy to the systems, and preparing to quickly mitigate the consequences of disruption, if there is one, would decrease the pressure to respond immediately during the conflict, and this would reduce the escalation risks, actually. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrei. Now, Leah, you said before that the current communication systems are not necessarily reliable and secure, and also Marion before called for the need for communication measures as a risk reduction tool. Now, let me ask you very concretely: how would you build? I mean, how would that look like a perfect communication system in your view between the nuclear weapon states?
Well, thank you for the question. And I will first start by saying that I'm part of the CATLINK team at the Institute for Security and Technology, where we are trying to do just that, which is build a modern, more secure, more resilient crisis communication system. So I want to draw on some of the principles that we have built into that design process, but I think that these key principles are important for any sort of hotline or crisis communication system that is developed by us or by any state or by any other organization. And the first is the importance of simplicity. We have a fantastic advisor at IST who really likes to remind us very helpfully that complexity is the enemy of security. The more complicated, the more complex, the more parts in a system, the harder it is to verify the security and the resilience of that system. If we are talking about simple communication systems, there's no need to go complex. There's no need to build an iPhone for crisis communication. So simplicity means verifiability, and that is really important so that every side can look at the code, can look at the design and say, I see every nook and cranny. I know that there's nothing nasty hidden in there for me. I think second draws on that last point, which is the need for agreement and buy-in from all relevant countries. So if we are looking at developing new crisis communication systems for states with nuclear weapons, all states with nuclear weapons need to be involved from the beginning, otherwise they will never trust the product. And that means technical exchanges with technical experts and engineers and scientists from the respective countries. It also means diplomatic engagement and ensuring that diplomats from different levels are speaking to each other and are preparing for all possible permutations of use with the system. That process and that buy-in, if done well and honestly, can be risk reducing of its own accord. Just having the conversations and the diplomatic process and ensuring that these counterparts from different countries are interacting with each other, discussing critical issues and building trust, that in of itself, separate from the risk reducing capabilities of the system, is a net gain. And I think fostering that sort of environment where states can have those honest conversations can go a long way in not just bringing forward new risk reduction technologies, but being risk reducing in of themselves. Lastly, I think I am very keen on crisis communications. It's a rather important part of my job, but I don't think we should stop there. I think we have had some fantastic discussions about risk reduction this RevCon, and I'm sure they will continue. And I think that the best chance at actionable risk reduction is to have a toolkit, to have a menu of options, because as each of my co-panelists have discussed, there are different cultures, there are different views on risk reduction in different states. The more options we have to put forward to states with nuclear weapons and also all of the very helpful and very engaged states without nuclear weapons who have done so much work in putting risk reduction forward, the more options there are to agree upon, the better off we will be. And we're at a very interesting time in the history of humanity, shall we say, in terms of technology. There are new technologies that could allow for novel approaches to risk reduction. And the more that we map out those options and the more that we offer those options to states, the better off we will be in reducing nuclear risk.
Thank you also to Julia, and thank you again to all the four panelists. I think we've covered already a lot of ground, which will certainly now nurture the discussion we have, and that's now my undertaking to take some questions from the floor. Unfortunately, we have a bit of limited time, and so I'll try to get maybe three questions. And then we will see where we stand. So please, I would like to ask you to raise your hands, maybe to briefly introduce yourself, and in the sake of time, please keep your question short and concise, and maybe also indicate to which panelist you would like to address the question if you would like to do so. Maybe I'll collect 3 questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, George William Gallofer with the Austrian MFA. Thank you very much for the interesting presentations and for the panel. 2 comments, if I may. Marion very well laid out the sort of calculation element between consequences and risks. Maybe just one point there. I think also the consequences side has shifted a little bit, not just in terms of the actual impact, new weapons being developed, but also, of course, in the great understanding we now have of the impact, the cross-boundary impacts, the new modeling tools. Leah rightly pointed out that we now have new technological means, but they also go into helping us understand just how grave the implications are of nuclear weapons explanations and even more, of course, of conflict. So I think it's important to also bear that out in terms of looking at scientific facts of the consequences and also then weighing that up with the sort of deterrence theories and the impacts there, because that's really a conversation that's missing a little bit. That intersection and that crossplay between the risks that are there, the consequences, and then deterrence as a theory that's being applied right now in terms of adding security for all of us. And giving these sort of risks that we've laid out, of course, it's essential that we have risk reduction. It's essential because we need to it's essential as an obligation also for those that subject everybody to those risks to actually then take measures urgently to reduce them. And I think it was a good point also, again, coming back to Leah, that we need a menu, we need a broad menu. And we have actually developed a menu. If we look back, I mean, of course, there's a huge amount of work from places like UNIDIR, but also already discussed between states. If you look back at 2016, the Open-Ended Working Group, there was actually a very broad-based set of risk reduction measures that came out of a negotiating process. Now, the final document wasn't agreed, but it didn't stumble over this risk element. That was actually something that was very consensual. So we do have a rather large menu. And what really came out there was that these measures have to be broad-based. They can't just be sort of very limited to conversations, to sort of a small set of measures. But in fact, for them to be credible, they need to actually also contain concrete elements that take us away as far as possible from nuclear explosions and nuclear accidents. And so I think that's also, an important takeaway for the NPT RevCon here. When we talk about risk reduction, it can't just be setting up a couple of conversations. It actually has to be taking up this menu and moving it forward. And just maybe a final point, if I may, because it's very timely. We mentioned existing agreements working. Of course, we've had a couple of agreements slipping away lately. But more than that, I mean, if you look at New START as an example, just now we've had the Russians suspending the inspections. So even those instruments actually are in danger. So we just relying on the existing instruments, I'm not sure really will get us far enough. In fact, we need to really move forward on risk reduction to make an actual meaningful impact for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I think there was a question. First, the gentleman on the right, and then Mexico. Tony, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the organizers and the panelists for this timely and very thought-provoking presentation. I very much appreciated the specificity of the proposals, very much welcome. I want to take it back to the relationship between nuclear risk reduction and actual nuclear disarmament measures, because that's a very interesting relationship. And I think there seems to be consensus that the former is not a substitute for the latter, and indeed the point was made that nuclear risk reduction measures are to be seen as conducive to nuclear disarmament as opposed to being a substitute for nuclear disarmament. I guess my question is whether any of the panelists have any thoughts. When one says that nuclear risk reduction is conducive to nuclear disarmament, whether a sequencing is implied in that formulation, whether there is whereby nuclear disarmament, perhaps in that understanding, would not happen unless and until nuclear risk reduction measures have taken place, versus perhaps another view on the matter, where simultaneity. Whether you believe that both risk reductions and actual disarmament measures can happen at once. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, and let me take now the question from you, Tony, from Mexico.
Thank you. Thank you for the side event and for the interesting presentation, especially the perspectives from different regions, points of view, different points of view in the world. And that's why I wanted to make a comment to seek views from the panel, because one of the constant friction or tensions, at least in multilateral discussions, is the fact that most of the countries in the world don't have nuclear weapons and don't have adhered to different groups of treaties that prohibit nuclear weapons for themselves or in the regions, like nuclear weapon-free zones, and they don't see this as an issue that pertains to them. But this is an issue that pertains only to the nuclear possessors, nuclear weapon states. So I'm not saying that I endorse that view. I am just saying that this is a source of, at least in the discourse, some type of conflict. So what would you say, because of the title of this side event, that is how to take forward this issue in the review conference, what would you say to the widest audience that don't or the widest amount of countries that don't have nuclear weapons, why this issue should be pursued in a way that doesn't contradict the view of the widest majority that have rejected nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Thank you also to you, Tony. Maybe I'll take one last question if there is any. I think there would be more than, but let me take the two gentlemen over there. Please be as short as possible.
Aaron Humphreys, on behalf of the Christian Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. While it's true that dialogue surrounding nuclear risk reduction is gaining in prominence, it is vital for states to remember that it is no substitute for nuclear disarmament and total elimination. As a UK-based NGO, we pay special attention to the position of the UK in these matters. I wondered if any of today's speakers would be able to recommend any further practical measures that the British government could take in relation to the topics covered during the session. I'd also like to invite anyone to explain how the following are consistent with the risk reduction agenda. First, the UK's decision to raise its nuclear cap. Second, the return of US nuclear weapons to RAF Lakenheath. And third, the continued deployment of US weapons in non-nuclear weapon states in Europe. I'd like to finish by also noting just how concerned my organisation is regarding the potential for Russian nuclear weapons to be deployed in Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, the gentleman over there, that's the last question.
And I was the NGO speaker on risk reduction. And I'm also holding a panel on nuclear risk reduction on the 19th in Conference Room B. There's been very little discussion of specific measures of risk reduction. We've tended to sort of skate around. About the only thing that's been mentioned specifically was de-alerting. But there's a very, very strong push. And indeed, I'm on the steering committee of the No First Use Global campaign, and there is certainly a very strong push for no first use as a risk reduction measure, not obviously to the exclusion of any other risk reduction measure. And I would certainly like some feedback from members of your panel on no first use and any other measures that you think stand out as obvious first moves on risk reduction.
Okay, thank you so much. So let me start maybe with the last question. What would be a standout as measures, as first measures? So would I don't know if who would yes, Marion? Yes.
Sure. Did you just want me to address the one question or all of them?
You can also maybe potentially come back on the first and the third question.
First and third.
Is it conducive to nuclear disarmament and the sequencing issue?
Yeah, certainly. Okay. All right. So I'll start with: is there sequencing implied, or could they take place in parallel? So I think, you know, in theory, if we sort of disregard for a moment the fact that both risk reduction and disarmament take place in a political environment, they could, of course, take place in parallel. However, I think in the current environment that's characterized with quite high tensions, risk reduction has the added advantage of reducing tensions that need to be reduced, in my opinion, before states would feel comfortable committing to further disarmament steps. So I think that is where any feeling of a need to sequence is coming from, just because, you know, various nuclear weapon states have indicated that they would be interested in implementing risk reduction measures, even at a time where they feel that further disarmament is not possible for them. So that's the only reason why I think that a sequencing is more likely than going ahead in parallel. On the question of you know, how risk reduction, how important risk reduction is for all states, even states that don't have nuclear weapons. One of the early works that BASIC undertook with support from the Netherlands was actually looking at risk reduction measures that all states can do. And we very much took the perspective that all states have a role to play in bringing about risk reduction. And so I think there's a lot that states without nuclear weapons can do in order to encourage risk reduction further, especially when it comes to the newer or disruptive technologies that we see, because there are many states without nuclear weapons who are actually leaders when it comes to those technologies. And as several of my colleagues mentioned, some of these interactions are very concerning. So without taking up too much time now, there's quite a lot out there about what other states can do, and you know, you can also always grab me after this event. We can talk in more detail. But I absolutely think that risk reduction is important for all states, because it's also a really important tool that we've got to reduce distrust. And then finally, to pick up the point on no first use or other risk reduction measures. So again, I think no first use, you know, what was a really great idea, perhaps before the war in Ukraine started, because I think that war has unfortunately shifted the environment quite a bit. And I think it's very unlikely that states would want to consider implementing a no first use declaration at this point. And the other thing that I would say on declaratory policy, or declaratory policies, is that they tend to work better in an environment where you have a certain level of trust, which I think we just don't have at the moment. So I think in that sense, any risk reduction measures or any other measures that would help to rebuild some of that trust ought to take precedent, so that we can just make headway on some of these other risk reduction measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. So mindful of time management, let me maybe get through the remaining three panelists, and you can address, I mean, the questions that you wish to address. So let me maybe start with you, Tong, if this is right for you.
Well, thank you. I'll briefly address the relationship between risk reduction and disarmament. I think if a country wants to really rely on nuclear deterrence, it will have to constantly remind people that the nuclear risk is real. It can really use nuclear weapons in a crisis. So in that sense, risk reduction forces a country to reduce its reliance on nuclear weapons. It forces a country to put nuclear weapons in the back burner of its national security strategy. So if that can be achieved, I think it's certainly very conducive to nuclear disarmament. On the issue of no first use, it's certainly a very helpful measure for reducing nuclear risk, and countries like China have adopted this policy. The challenge is nuclear use and non-use, the line between the two is becoming blurry. Because again, as Russia demonstrated, a country doesn't have to use nuclear weapons to achieve benefit. It can simply threaten or even implicitly threaten nuclear use to achieve coercive benefit. So I think one thing countries can do is to not only promise not to use nuclear weapons, but promise not to threaten to use nuclear weapons. But of course, here, the tricky part is how to define nuclear threat. I think that's where I think more discussion can happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Tong. And now the same for André. You can pick up on just any questions you wish to.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. To our Austrian colleagues, you were modest enough not to mention great risk reduction paper by Austrian, which I encourage everybody to read, which has a lot of those, menu things which could be implemented. On risk reduction, nuclear disarmament, and sequencing, as long as there are nuclear weapons, there would be need of nuclear risk reduction, even had we had a, disarmament process and had we been cutting 100 nuclear weapons every day, we would still need nuclear risk reduction as long as the process continued. So I don't think they can be sequential. You need to do nuclear risk reduction. And the last point to Tony's question about how non-nuclear weapon states should engage with risk reduction. Well, there was a nuclear risk reduction package by Stockholm Initiative last year. And, if you look at the top line, what non-nuclear weapon states can do is transparency in CBM, preservation of disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation architecture, and foster dialogue to decrease tensions. Those are, things you would want to do even if there were no nuclear weapons. You want dialogue, you want foster those relationships. So in that sense, those are the things that non-nuclear weapon states should be interested in doing regardless. So it's, I think, nice synergy there.
Thank you to André, and final to Leah.
Thank you. I want to touch quickly, following up on André, the discussion of the role that non-nuclear weapon states can have. I think non-nuclear weapon states have been and continue to be critical to the risk reduction process. We've spoken a lot about the Stockholm Initiative, but I think it's been very illustrative of the immense power that non-nuclear weapon states can have when they come together and hold nuclear weapon states accountable. Also, we discussed a lot in this conversation how new technologies can enable new avenues for risk reduction. Technology development is not just centered in nuclear weapon states. And there are going to be very promising ideas and techniques and technologies that come out from technology centers outside of nuclear weapon states. And I think it's important to have continued communication between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states so that those ideas, when they come up, can be put into the risk reduction pipeline, because it is in everyone's interest, everyone on Earth's interest, to reduce nuclear risk. And then just lastly, on the fourth question about actual measures to reduce nuclear risk, at my company, we're quite fond of the idea of using crisis communications. It's something that we have heard discussed often in this RevCon. And it is one of those risk reduction measures that has been around for a long time, that has proven quite useful in the past. Obviously, the hotline between the United States and Russia has been used several times to varying effects, but overall it has been, in my opinion, risk reducing and stabilizing to know that in a moment of crisis, that line is there. And I think building on the network of crisis communications that we have today, especially as states modernize their arsenals, why not, for much cheaper, modernize their crisis communication systems?
Thank you, Leah, and this concludes our Q&A session. So before closing the event, as I said at the very beginning, it's my pleasure now to invite Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Alexandra Bell to provide some additional remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll start by saying I've gotten to speak from this dais before in my personal capacity, but today I will be speaking on behalf of the United States, so I'll be on much better behavior. Thank you to my Dutch and Swiss colleagues and to UNIDIR for hosting this event, for allowing me to speak, and for all the work that you do to promote risk reduction. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders in Washington and Moscow worked together to construct guardrails against miscalculations and misperceptions that could lead to nuclear war. Those risk reduction measures were the foundation of treaties like the NPT. I hope it's abundantly clear and universally accepted that we do not need another Cuban Missile Crisis to show us that risk reduction continues to be vitally important. For our part, the United States is committed to advancing this work, but make no mistake, this is not something we simply do as busy work or a distraction or a substitute while bilateral arms control talks with other nations seem somewhat distant. This is something we must do, that all of us must do, to maintain and strengthen global security. Risk reduction is arms control. Arms control is risk reduction. This might seem obvious to people at the NPT RevCon or to people who came to this session, but it's not clear to so many people. That's actually a problem. Many people have gotten used to the idea that arms control can only come in the form of legally binding treaties approved by our respective legislatures. But arms control is so much more than that. It's military to military dialogues. It's scientific cooperation. It's the development of codes of conduct and norms of behavior, transparency and confidence building measures, best practices, political commitments, and of course, treaties. It is all these tools and mechanisms that can help us reduce the likelihood of nuclear war and reduce nuclear risks. That's why the ongoing streams of work in the Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament Dialogue, the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative, and the Stockholm Initiative for Nuclear Disarmament, the P5 process, as well as all the work in civil society and academia, has to go forward. The United States also plans to expand risk reduction conversations around the world, including in Southeast Asia, as part of our work as a co-chair of the ASEAN Regional Forum Intersessional Meeting on Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, along with Sri Lanka and Thailand. We're also very committed to secure communications for crisis prevention and crisis management. We love to show off our National Nuclear Risk Reduction Center, so if you're ever in Washington, you can come by. In January 2022, leaders of the P5 jointly affirmed that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The United States was hoping that that statement, the first of its kind among P5 leaders, was a small step, a first small step towards moving the discussion of multilateral risk reduction from a discussion to the actual adoption and implementation of multilateral risk reduction measures. Of course, you all know that the metaphorical ink was barely dry on that statement before Russia began waging a brutal war of aggression on Ukraine, and President Vladimir Putin sought to stoke fears of nuclear escalation. We know that strengthening risk reduction is going to necessitate holding Russia accountable for its actions. The United States assumed the chair of the P5 on June 1st. For those of you who know me, you might not be surprised that we have big plans for what we'd like to do and ambitions for our chairmanship, plans that have understandably been thrown off by Russia's choices, but it's not for Russia, or indeed any nation, to undermine global progress to reduce nuclear risks. We will adjust our focus and our methods as necessary, but we will continue to advance the goals of the NPT. As President Biden said, today, perhaps more than any other time since the Cold War, we must work to reduce nuclear risks of an arms race or nuclear escalation. We have to do better. We have to do more, not in spite of the challenges that we currently face, but because of them. We must also accept that we have a long road ahead of us. The instability and insecurity of the prevailing security environment inarguably affects our ability to advance arms control and, yes, disarmament, as does the lack of political will among relevant parties. But we must press on, and we will press on. Recalling the words of the late Michael Crapon, a giant in the field of arms control and disarmament, we should remember what we have accomplished in terms of risk reduction so far, despite the odds. He reminded us, and I quote, "Progress in our line of meaningful work is never linear. We live in hard times. All the more reason to remember this. Our aims are true. Our accomplishments fall short of our aims. Even so, our accomplishments are significant. The meaningful work, our work, has made this world a safer place. We have a lot more work to do." Michael was right about that, as he was about so many things. We have work to do. Risk reduction is a key part of that work. So let's get to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. I just cite one sentence you said. We need not another Cuban crisis to pursue nuclear risk reduction, and I think that's the call for our review conference, and that's also now concluding the event. Let me once again expressing really my deepest thanks to our panelists, Marion, Tong, Andre, and Leah. And also the teams of UNIDIR for organizing the event, the team of BASIC, the team of the Netherlands, and my own team, the Swiss team. Thank you to the audience for joining us for this event over lunch, and also for your active participation. As usual with UNIDIR events, we would be welcoming your feedback on the event, and forums have been, I think, provided to this end, and I can just encourage you to fill these in. Finally, as already Director Guy said at the very beginning, there is a lot of work and material to explore on nuclear risk reduction on the relevant respective websites of UNIDIR and BASIC. So that's it. Thank you so much here in the room, and also to all those of you who joined us on the webcast. And let me wish you a nice afternoon. Thank you.